2020. About a year after moving there, I became a Christian, and life hasn't been the same since. My conversion was a real surprise, because many years before, decades actually, I was heavily involved in the occult. So this is a testimonial I'd like to share with you. I hope it has the effect of reminding you, once again, how wonderful God is. So I was a bit of a strange kid. Despite being sporty and quite physical, I was also introverted and intense, with a strong interest in religion and spirituality. Without having read about them before, I'd end up figuring out theological concepts like predestination and Pascal's wager in my early teens. So I think I had a natural spiritual vocation in life. But without the benefit of a Christian upbringing, I didn't have the opportunity to become a pastor or a priest. So I ended up forging my own spiritual path instead. The combination of a naturally strong spiritual interest without appropriate guidance proved to be dangerous, as being young and unguided, I had no ability to discern lies from truth, which is one of the most important weapons we can arm ourselves with in the fight against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. On that note, the concept of spiritual warfare was also one I was aware of at a young age, but more in the practical sense than the intellectual one. I often felt my life and my soul was a battleground between the powers of darkness and light. And going into my teenage years, I passed through alternating phases of pledging myself to God and the devil. One of the reasons for this polarity came from a strong attraction to the mythos and glamour of Satan presented in films, music, and TV. But at the same time, I had the desire to be a good and decent person, so I can't rationally determine why I have such a strong attraction to the father of lies. As to that, I wonder, in hindsight, if a demonic presence had attached itself to me back then, even if one hadn't at that stage. What would happen next was evidence that perhaps one soon would. With the devil being in my thoughts too often, I would soon develop tastes that were very macabre in nature, including a strange fascinations with symbols like swastikas in the rooms. This rabbit hole would start to go even deeper when, at the age of 13, I had my first experience with magic. After developing a long-lasting cluster of warts on my left hand, that nothing seemed to shift, a family member taught me a way of getting rid of them using a traditional folk magic cure. I don't want to repeat the exact procedure, but within about a week of performing it, all the warts had totally vanished. Although I questioned if that was a mind over matter thing rather than a supernatural event, the fact remained that I'd been mysteriously cured shortly after performing a magical ritual. And this had a huge effect on how my spiritual path would develop in my adolescence and young adulthood. About a year or so after that first experiment with magic, a sequence of events happened that I should have paid more attention to, but again didn't have the maturity or guidance to stay away from. That sequence of events began with some of the hallmarks of what is referred to as demonic infestation. This is a phenomenon in which the target is not possessed, but can be subjected to pestering and harassment by an entity that wants them to know about its existence. For me, these manifestations mostly involve my bed shaking just after I got in it at night. Not as extreme as what you might see in The Exorcist, but it was a very real event for me that I was conscious of, and definitely not in my mind. It wasn't a physiological or mechanical thing, like a lorry outside or shaking about. And it scared me at first, but over time, this happened for several months. It became tolerable. It would also sometimes be accompanied by rhythmic tapping on the radiator pipes down my bed, which doesn't sound quite so unusual, but that and the shaking of the bed which was happening would stop if I told it to. And then after getting some brief peace, it would all start happening again. That would go on for some time, usually until I fell asleep. Occasionally I'd wake up in the middle of the night and it was happening again. That went on for a few months, and then eventually it just stopped happening. But the timing of it stopping happening came with this exceptionally foul stench outside of my bedroom, which I'd never encountered before, and I've never smelt it again, luckily. It was like a mixture of ammonia, vomit, and rotting meat. It was really overpowering, and no one else in the house could smell it apart from me. Later in that day, that smell had completely gone, and I didn't have any similar manifestations at that stage of my life. But after this, over the next few years, my interest in magic and the occult grew, though at the time I didn't see any connection between that growing interest, the strange manifestations that happened, and before then, the wart-busting sorcery of what's done. If my soul had been a battleground between God and the devil before that, well, my mid to late teens, I was at the point where I yielded myself readily to the devil. It was at this stage, being a victim of bullying, I unleashed curses on two people who made my life difficult, and hate-filled praise to Satan, and sadly, awful results with the outcomes for both of them. Though, as is the nature of things with magic, I couldn't say with complete certainty that my curses were the definite cause of the unfortunate things that happened to them. By the time then I was 18, the evidence that Satan had a hold over me was very obvious. I was heavily into death and black metal, on a few books about the occult and black magic, wore an inverted crucifix around my neck, and was developing an interest in things like Jungian psychology and pagan mythology. And when I started at university, my first wave of interest in the occult peaked. With access to the internet for the first time, which is back in the mid-90s, I quickly discovered the websites of organizations like the Church of Satan and the Temple of Set. I don't recall the exact thoughts that prompted me to search for them back then, but I think the main motivation at that point was my devotion to the black metal scene, which is infamous around that time because it's next to a series of church burnings and murders in Norway. While I was never inspired to burn a church down, I connected strongly with the darkness, the rebellion, and the lack of concern about things like normality and conformity that music portrayed. It gave me a feeling of meaningfulness, because in my life I'd been a bit of an outcast and a misfit, and that seemed to make me feel more in tune with the world somehow. It wasn't until about 5 years after leaving university that I would actually join one of those groups that I'd been researching. Despite my interest in the occult peaking very strongly in my mid to late teens, by my early 20s, that would disappear for a while. I put that down to a difference in attitude that going to university made. My outlook went from being very mystical when I started there to very materialistic by the time I finished. I think that largely happened because my degree was in psychology. I became influenced by the approach of the behaviorists, who saw life as ultimately devoid of meaning. When I was becoming atheistic in my beliefs, like the demons who believe and shudder, I always knew there was a God. But with the influence of more materialistic worldviews in my consciousness, I became very discouraged about any matters of a religious or spiritual nature. I put them to the back of my mind, preferring cavorting, drinking and socializing to the more introspective pursuits of spirituality. But then, a few years later, when I finally owned my own home and had a lot of spare time and space on my hands, my interest in the occult and magic came back with a vengeance, and I started deep diving internet resources to make up for the years of inactivity. After months of reading pirated PDFs, debating in online forums, and dabbling in the occasional clumsy ritual, I became a member of the Temple of Set, whose openly theistic approach was more appealing to me than the Church of Satan's atheistic philosophy. What I remember most about this period, from my current perspective, is how much my arrogance and pride were inflated by my membership there. Its members used titles like elect when addressing each other, which I now see were used to instill a sense of separateness and superiority in its nobles, who, unlike the common hordes, were trainee masters of the universe, destined for godhood. But in reality, when you looked around at the other members, that wasn't what you were seeing at all. You were seeing the lonely, the lost, the ineffectual, the bullied, the lonely, and those who were just desperate to have some kind of control over their existence, something that made them stand out and feel special and unique compared to everyone else. And that's exactly what I was like most of the time. Despite my denial of it, I was a weak, ineffective, and shy person with a low opinion of himself, who was trying hard to be strong, relevant, and powerful. Someone who could stretch out his hand and take whatever he wanted from the delights that the world had to offer. But that never really happened. Practicing magic might enable you to affect the reality of the world around you in minor ways, but never to the extent that you believed it could. It gave you enough of what it promised to keep you trapped, making you think that the more you learned and the more you dedicated your time and energy to it, the more you would eventually gain. But like all the cons of the devil, it was largely based on the delivery of false promises backed up by the occasional appearance of a carrot dangling on the end of a stick. But at that point in time, I was a long way from understanding that. All my membership in the Temple of Set was relatively short at 3 years. The foundations of magical practice that were laid there would dominate my life for a large part of the next 2 decades. It turned me into a serious student of the occult, and eventually, after a brief period in the Rune Guild and time spent studying the early Gnostic traditions, my interest in magic and the occult waned again. However, as it did before, it would appear stronger than ever after 3 years of silence. And this time it would dominate my life for the longest and most intense period in which all the really horrible, dark stuff would happen. This period became as intense as it did after I joined an initiatory order founded by Aleister Crowley. I was initiated into several of its degrees. I would eventually assist in sponsoring and help initiate new members. My time there led to me becoming proficient in astrology, tarot, Kabbalah, and various forms of divination, meditation, and ceremonial magic. It was the last of these practices, ceremonial magic, which involves performing elaborate rituals designed to enable contact with demonic entities, that I would spend most of my time and energy on. And I would eventually gain enough expertise to teach and lead others about the theoretical and practical requirements necessary to make those rituals work. Without going into detail, the hundreds of rituals that I took part in over those years led to me seeing and experiencing many things that the rational mind would struggle to find credible. I had it verified, sometimes in the presence of others, who usually had their own strange stories to tell, that there was a firm reality in the powers of darkness that, looking back, was sometimes frightening enough to leave traumatic residues that even now haven't entirely subsided. Alongside these spiritually illicit activities came some patterns of behaviour you might expect from someone interested in such things. As I've already hinted, that getting into magic in the first place had its roots in feelings of powerlessness and low self-worth that came from being bullied as a youth. So a large part of my motivation was geared towards the attainment of power and respect. And to some extent it worked, because I sometimes gained more success and popularity and feelings of pride and self-esteem to divert my attention away from my negative self-image. At the height of my involvement in that order, my spare time, personal relationships, and social life were all connected to it, leaving all of my brittle eggs stowed in one very dubious basket. Not at all believing in the concept of sin, I had very poor moral discernment, going through 2 failed marriages, as I dedicated myself to an egotistical lifestyle in which seeking pleasure, indulgence, and satisfaction were exalted. More important to me than fleshly motivations, however, was the sense that I was a priest of my own religion. My spiritual drive had always been high, and my main motivation in life from an early age was the pursuit of God. But my understanding of what and who God really is was entirely perverted, as I was ultimately pursuing Him on my terms, not His. This, I think, is one of the biggest threats that the occult, the New Age, cults, and false religions pose to humanity. They seek to pervert and usurp the part of us that yearns to know God and twist it into something unrecognizable. Occultism, to me, was something I held on to for purely selfish purposes. I had a naturally strong spiritual drive, but through foolishness and ignorance it allowed it to become perverted. I sought God desperately in my heart, but by preferring to form my own spiritual path, in which I pulled the strings according to my whims by using magic, that desire was corrupted by the enemy. Considering this, I'm often struck at how the tactics of the serpent in Genesis 3 haven't changed at all. Now, as then, his primary tactic is to make us doubt what God has said and believe that we can imitate his power in a way that suits our personal preferences. My experience as a ceremonial magician, I came across frequent and consistent examples of magic working and demonic beings appearing to have an agency in the world that can't be written off as coincidental or imaginary. This is why, even with my tendency to be rational most of the time, my experiences have caused me to firmly believe in the existence of the entities that I so stupidly demanded the attention of in the interest of experimentation and attaining peak experiences. All the effects of some of these encounters sometimes made me hesitant to perform certain rituals again. I was far too invested in the occult and magical practices to quit. A simple but sensible explanation explains why I was unable to back out of this spiraling descent. That was from Jerry Brashear's statement in his series of lectures on spiritual warfare, where he concluded that involvement in the demonic is progressively more difficult to withdraw from the further into you its hooks get. So, like someone suffering from drug or alcohol addiction, getting more devoted to your habit makes it harder to withdraw, not easier. Ultimately, with the occult, the poison barbs that burrow under the skin can't just be tugged out. For me, the proof of that was found not only in my inability to stop when things got real, but in the fact that years of inactivity from those practices eventually would always lead back to a major return to them. This happened to me not once but twice. Pushing those barbs even further under my skin was the fact that the occult also formed a major part of my identity, being the foundation of my relationship at the time, my social life, and most of my spare time. So giving all that up would be the equivalent of giving up my entire life. And by the end of 2019, having gone through a few too many negative experiences with ceremonial magic, I'd fallen back to some less extreme practices and focused on the points where Eastern religions like Shaivism, which is a sect of Hinduism, and Tibetan Buddhism met with the Gnostic traditions of the West. This led to a less magical approach to spirituality, though there was still plenty of scope for danger in the practice of Kundalini Yoga. The manipulation of Kundalini energy was something I practiced with intensity during my time as a follower of the teachings of Aleister Crowley, and involved stimulating the body's flow of energy with the use of intense breathing exercises and the adoption of various yoga poses known as asanas, mudras. Some of the physical effects I experienced while doing this were very unusual and included experiencing visions, hearing strange noises and voices, rigidity of the spine and torso, the feeling of something trying to lift you up off the ground, feelings of being possessed by an alien energy, and the forced adoption of bodily positions and spontaneous dancing. That's all pretty strange. The more tangible danger of experimenting with these kinds of effects is the risk of the known phenomenon of Kundalini psychosis, in which the natural electrical energies that flow like a soft current through our nervous systems are whipped up into a lightning storm that has the potential to unleash real damage to practitioners' mental and physical health. The stimulation of this energy is one of the main aims of many types of magical practice, as when you become stirred up by it, you're in a natural shamanic state where your consciousness alters and you can more easily communicate with the entities that take a great interest in you when you open yourself up like a door to them. This is why not just occultism and magic, but anything related to the manipulation of states of consciousness, including meditation, all forms of yoga and psychedelic drugs, can bring the attention and interest of demonic entities and should therefore be heavily avoided. Now, the other philosophy I was interested in at that point was Gnosticism. You might well have heard of that, as its ideas featured heavily among the major heresies that the early church fought against. Among its texts, there are various false gospels, which, while passing on small amounts of truth, as false teachings usually do, they are inherently deceitful and heretical. It was while researching these texts in the early spring of 2021 that I read through the false Gospel of Philip. Now, although I'd read this text a few times before, one day, for the first time, I suddenly saw it for the complete fraud that it really was. Its ruse was to take philosophical concepts that didn't exist in Judea at the time of Christ, then put them alongside things that Jesus actually did say, to to make it look like he said a lot of weird stuff that he didn't. That wasn't really a surprise to me, but truly seeing this deceit for the first time struck me in a new way. For me, realizing that deceit juxtaposed with reading the genuine words of Jesus in those texts led to a deep realization that struck me in the heart. I began the process of removing the scales from my eyes. At the core of that realization was the fact that all of a sudden, the words of Jesus Christ resonated with me in a way that I'd never experienced before with any other spiritual philosophy. My next step after that was to get hold of a Bible and begin to read Matthew chapters 5 to 7, which I recognised as the source that false Gnostic Gospel had been quoting when it was reporting the real words of Jesus. Reading Jesus' words in their genuine context verified my suspicions that truth and love resided in them. And I was astonished at the strength of feelings that they were inspiring in me. Over the next few months, I bought some books about the Gospels and found that the more I read about them, the more I knew each found respect for Jesus was growing into love. Although I didn't yet fully identify as Christian, I was still dabbling with the tarot, runes and astrology occasionally. By the end of spring of that year, the pull towards Jesus had grown to the extent that I felt the need to put those things aside for good, pray regularly, and find a church to attend. By the end of the summer of that year, all those things were taken care of. I repented of my sins and I fully identified as a Christian. In the following months, I noticed some real changes occurring. My tastes and motivations, which had always been dark, sensual, and selfish, altered significantly. I no longer found myself enjoying thrash, death, and black metal. I could no longer find entertainment in films glorifying sex, violence, and the supernatural. I could no longer laugh at humour-based cruelty or obscenity. And I became overtly sensitive to blatant displays of sin, blasphemy, and concupiscence on TV, in the media, and in the wider world. For me, losing those things has been no loss at all, because the person who used to glorify those things and perform rituals to demons before obscene altars is dead. Amen. It feels true to say that it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the old has passed away, behold, the new has come. Of course, it wasn't only tastes, preferences and habits that changed, but many other aspects of life too. I put many friendships aside due to the influences they'd keep me exposed to. I rarely drink alcohol these days. I used to drink way too much. I am no longer consumed with the need to fulfill my passing passions and desires like I used to. That life is over now, and sometimes I can barely believe that I'm actually the same physical being now as I was then. This is of course we're very grateful for, really, because as we know, whoever loves his life will lose it, but whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Despite having been christened into the Church of Wales as an infant, I also grew convinced of my need to receive baptism as a willful act. This came in May of last year, when I asked Matt, who I came to know through his outreach work with people who'd been involved in the occult, to baptise me, which he did in the freezing cold river on the corner, which I'm sure a few of you are also familiar with. A couple of months after that, I followed Matt's advice in looking up a well-known former occultist who converted to Christianity a few years ago named Doreen Virtue. She in turn directed me towards a Facebook group for people who had a background in New Age and occult practices but had now found Christ. Although I really bother with Facebook groups, this is where I found myself being a bit more prolific on than usual. Then one day, when announcing on it that I was looking for a more community-focused and biblical church than the one I've been attending so far, a lady called Sally popped up in my messages recommending United Community Church, recommending United Community Church, or UCC, in Helsinki to me, which is where I currently live. I did a bit of research on it and agreed with her opinion. It was a good place and started attending there as soon as I could. Incredibly, my first 2 weeks of attendance there were about 5 other people who professed similar rescue stories to mine. It was their first weeks there as well. They'd been pulled out of the lies and of occultism and the New Age to profess the truth of Jesus Christ, just like I had. They were all members of the same Facebook group and had all been contacted by Sally as well when they were making various requests for good churches in the area. A little while later, I did something similar with another member of that group and introduced her to UCC. She's been attending ever since and was baptised there with some other members last October. As marvellous as all that was, I recently learned that this sort of mass rescue operation is actually so uncommon. On the pastor of UCC, Sean's advice, while visiting Wales over Christmas just gone, I attended Grace Church in Bridgend due to it being on the campus of the Union School of Theology, where, even though he's originally from Connecticut and is now based in Helsinki, he once attended, which is quite an amazing coincidence. On telling the pastor in Bridgend, John, a little information about my background, he informed me that around the same time I was going through my conversion experiences, 3 other people from occult backgrounds began independently attending Grace Church. One of them, he then introduced me to the next week. On chatting with that chap, we noticed some interesting correlations between our stories. But one of the greatest, though, being the fact, like me, his move from occultism to Christianity came after reading excerpts from the Gospels, which he described as just striking him in the heart, which is exactly the same thing that will happen to me. On telling Matt about this, he told me that a few years ago, he had a number of former witches all suddenly turn up here. I suddenly found Jesus. It's really wonderful to hear that it isn't just members of this church, my church and Grace Church where this has happened, but there are probably countless others out there too. It's also wonderful to know that Scripture is the means through which God reveals His truth in a very vital and living way. It's not just words on a page. It can actually strike you in the heart. That God's grace and mercy are unfathomable, and no matter what you've done, repentance can wash you clean. That God works through us and those around us in ways that are both incredible and verifiable. This ultimately needs that the church needs all of us, and we all need the church. Finally, it's wonderful to know that even though many are deceived by him, Satan will ultimately lose. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. It is so good to know as Christians we are on the winning side. And so we'll do something a little different, and that is we'll open up for questions tonight. And if anyone has any questions about Christianity or Satanism or spiritual warfare, then please ask away, and David will answer them all.
Maybe or maybe not correctly. But if anyone wants to come and talk to me afterwards as well, that's fine too.
Can I ask you a question there? You mentioned about your yoga there, where you was having like stern spines and muscle contractions and whatever and things like that. I'd never experienced until last year a major panic attack where I've had this huge energy sort of take over from me there. Is there anything you could explain regarding a similarity like that?
It's very difficult to explain rationally. I did quite a bit of research on the internet when I was doing that those kind of practices, and there's a lot of material about there. They say that it's part of a phenomenon which I mentioned called Kundalini psychosis, and it does come with these surges of energy. And with me, it was like my entire body would go stiff. And sometimes some very strange things would occur, like I heard horses galloping past at one point, and you'd suddenly find your hands moving in ways that you've been planning to. It was a very strange thing. But the burst of energy, yeah, it is. I think it can feel like a nice feeling, like an elated feeling, but it gets a bit more sinister after that.
About the electricity that sort of runs through your body, that's what I'm